Good morning. We have arranged for a beautiful day here on Kiowa Island, as opposed to last weekend, which was not so beautiful, but today promises to be quite nice, and it is going to warm up from the mid-60s, I understand. So you are here today for a special Beneath the Oaks presentation. We'll be focusing on low country resiliency, and I hope that you will enjoy our main speaker. She's here. Her name is Rebecca. Let me get this right. Rebecca McMackin. And she will be speaking to you on resiliency in your own gardens, resiliency in working with others and designing their gardens, and how we can change, perhaps, the way that people view their gardens. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sean Cannon, and he will introduce Rebecca. Sean?
Thank you, Peggy. I'm Sean Cannon. I'm the Restoration and Enhancement Specialist for the Kiowa Conservancy. Magic unfolds in the low country every day. Marsh grasses breathe in the wind, oaks stretch towards the salt air, and beneath their shade, water and earth meet in quiet conversation. Every native plant, from spartina in the marsh to wildflowers in our meadows, reminds us that resilience begins in the roots. At the Kiowa Conservancy, we believe that plants are the first stewards of this place. They hold the land, filter our waters, nurture wildlife, and connect people to the living systems that sustain us all. Each native plant we protect or plant is a step towards a more resilient low country, one that can adapt, recover, and thrive for generations. Our keynote speaker, Rebecca McMackin, understands this truth deeply. As an ecologically focused horticulturalist and designer, she has redefined what it means to create beauty that sustains. Through her leadership at Brooklyn Bridge Park, an industrial waterfront became a living ecosystem, one that hums with pollinators, shelters birds, and invites people to experience nature as an active, creative partner. Rebecca's work reminds us that beauty and ecology are not opposites, they are allies. She challenges us to ask not only how a landscape looks, but what it gives back. Today, I invite you to listen deeply, to learn from Rebecca, and to carry your curiosity into the conversations and breakout sessions ahead. Ask questions, seek inspiration, and discover how, together, we can cultivate a low country that is both resilient and alive. Finally, on behalf of the Kiowa Conservancy, thank you to our partners, sponsors, and planning committee for making this day possible, and for sharing in our mission to ensure that the land and water's ability to sustain life endures for generations. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca McMackin.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me down to your absolutely gorgeous region. It's my first time to Charleston, and I was driving in from the airport last night, and just the side of the road was gorgeous. There was a broom sedge, what we call Andropogon glomeratus, and I was wondering if there's a better common name down here, just growing on the side of the road, and the sun was low, and it was like silver in fluorescence, just absolutely gorgeous. And there was love grass, and the pink muley grass, and solidago, and I just can't get over how gorgeous it was, just like on the side of the road. You really have something so beautiful and worth protecting here. It really feels almost magical. So thank you for inviting me down here. I grew up in southern New England, so very different environment, very magical in a different way. But I grew up gardening, and my mom started me gardening when I was 6 years old. And I had no idea that gardening was a real job. I thought it was just sort of like the same way you cook, you garden. You know, this is how you get food, where food comes from. And like many rural kids, I got out of there the moment I could drive. I was off to New York City, and I spent an incredibly wild youth working in fashion and art, and only then ecology when I was much older. But I never really fell in love with anything. I was always bumping around, having fun, until I found horticulture. And it was specifically urban ecological horticulture that drew me in. And so I moved to New York City, and I worked there for most of my career, cultivating beautiful and biodiverse landscapes on public lands in some of the harshest conditions you could ever imagine. And so I was head gardener for historic Washington Square Park in Manhattan, which is this incredibly beautiful park with a very rich cultural history, and still to this day remains the center of political action in New York City. Literally every protest march ends at Washington Square Park for a rally, and it was at this park that I became a public servant. And I recognized the role that stewards play in shaping these critical spaces for democracy specifically, and the important role that they played. This is the day after the It Gets Better rally in 2010. I don't know if you all remember that movement. It was at a time where we were all waking up to the tragic levels of self-harm that happen among queer youth. And there was this big movement of sort of elder queers to say, hold on, just wait till you get old enough, essentially, to move to a city, and life will get better. And so there was this big, beautiful, angry, sad protest that ended at Washington Square Park, where the park was covered in rainbow graffiti and glitter, and you can see my my Zelkova here, perhaps never having been so fabulous in its short life. And it was really that morning just looking around at the park and thinking about what a ridiculous and wonderful and important job it was to hold space for stuff like this. And from there I went to Brooklyn Bridge Park, where I worked for just over a decade. And I helped to build and run this massive public works project, absolutely humongous. It was the largest project of this scale in Brooklyn in 150 years, since the days of Olmsted. What we did was to take these derelict shipping piers that were out over the water between Brooklyn and Manhattan and turn them into just an absolutely world-class public park. And the designers of the park, Michael van Valkenburg and Associates, they always intended this park to provide habitat for New York City wildlife, as well as habitat for New York City people as well. And what they did in order to do that was to go and hike in the mountains of the region, to look at the views that people were drawn to, and the sorts of feelings and paths and environments, and then try to echo those in an urban design in a safe and accessible way, so that New York City kids could have the experience of hiking through a forest path or rolling down a hill, right? I think a lot of us, people who live in more wild spaces, take grade changes for granted, but cities are oppressively flat, and so just even the process of putting in hills was really wonderful. And then the hope, of course, was that animals would do the same thing, that they would realize this constructed area as real land. And the project is essentially an experiment in constructed ecology. So as director of horticulture, I recognize this as the best possible laboratory in which to track and support biodiversity, as well as to pull lessons from that process and share what we learned out with the rest of the world, which is literally what I'm doing here today. And so that was my role while I was there. I was overseeing construction, building out the horticulture department, and caring for the landscape, but then also really focused on outreach and education. And I did some designing, which is really fun, but when I left 3 years ago now, I went to go spend time during a fellowship, which was really wonderful to do, and during that fellowship, I spent my time thinking about how to do this work, how to share this work, how to educate people and inspire them to do the sort of work that we had, and care for land in ways that supports biodiversity. And while I still design the rare public garden, really lecturing and writing are my full-time jobs now. And my passion is for education, because I am convinced that people can take this knowledge and then do incredible things. That the work that we did at Brooklyn Bridge Park was really just sort of figuring out how to start it, but the work that the people in this room and the people all over the world who take that and run with it and sort of apply it to their home gardens and their home parks and, you know, commercial landscapes, etc., that's where we'll see really, really exciting things. And so, I'm hopeful that you all do take this information and run with it and then share your awesome stories with me. But at Brooklyn Bridge Park, it was really incredible to see the effect and how successful the strategies that we came up with really ended up being. It has been wildly successful. Just incredibly successful. The park hosts more than 5 million people every summer, the vast majority of whom are not there for butterflies. The Horde crew is up to over 20 people, and there's arborists and interns and a whole fleet of gardeners/ecologists who are still doing research, still conducting these experiments and making wonderful stories together. And it's in literally the largest, densest city in the entire country. The park has attracted rare birds, endangered plants, critically imperiled bumblebees like Bombus viridis here. This is the great golden bumblebee, and I love to tell those stories because a lot of people think of cities as ecologically destitute, that it's sort of like, alas, you know, just the species that can live anywhere will live in a city. But that's not actually true, and it's almost even a bit of a problematic viewpoint in this case. Cities just have very different ecology from surrounding regions. And in some cases, certain animals are drawn to them. So if you look at the distribution of Bombus viridis here, you can see that this rare bee is all around here, very rare, and then that's New York City. And then that's Philly. This is an urban bee. This is a bee that likes to live in cities, and the researchers now think that this is because it's very sensitive to the chemicals in agriculturally managed landscapes and suburban landscapes, as well as the diseases that jump out from managed bees. And so for this species, a city is a refuge. It's a place to get away from the toxicity of these other landscapes. And when you look at an aerial image of New York City, this is Long Island, this is Manhattan here, that's Central Park right there, and this is Brooklyn, and that's where Brooklyn Bridge Park is right there. The thing to notice here is just all of this green, right? So much green, and then just all of this gray, and just how much impervious surface that is. And what a poor design that is for both animals and people in reality. Currently, over half of humanity lives in cities, but that number is expected to hit 2/3 in just 5 years, according to the UN, when the world population is expected to hit 9.7 billion people. And so these cities are the sites of the most people living under extreme density with the most severe environmental erasure, which can be read as, of course, a dangerous tragedy, but also it can be read as the site of just transformational potential to bring these two things together. Because healthy ecology matters for people as much as it matters for all of the other organisms on the planet. And I believe that people have a right to live in a healthy environment. There was a study out of Finland just a few years ago where they took a bunch of Finnish daycares, and they ripped out parking lots and concrete around them, and they put in gardens and raised beds and little forests for the kids to play in. And they saw the immune system function of those kids skyrocket within 2 months, because they were just part of their environment, right? It's like literally their health is part of that environment. And there was another study about a decade ago out of Philadelphia by a group called the Urban Health Lab, and they took lots that were abandoned lots in underserved neighborhoods with high crime rates, and they cleaned up those lots and put in gardens and made them into little parks. And they saw gun crime in the vicinity of those little parks go down by 29%. It's just absolutely life-changing for people to live in an environment that is healthy and well cared for. And so I'm sure you've all heard of the process of redlining Do y'all know what that is? Where like certain neighborhoods have been historically earmarked for certain populations of people, usually browner people, usually less wealthy people, and certain neighborhoods are earmarked for whiter, more wealthy people. And what they found now, looking at that historic discrepancy, is that those neighborhoods that have been underserved over time, they have completely different ecological systems than the wealthier neighborhoods. And there was a study just a couple of years ago out of LA where they found that the birds of LA are literally racially segregated. That you have in browner neighborhoods in LA, that you have pigeons and starlings and like birds, again, that will live anywhere. And then as you go into the wealthier, whiter neighborhoods, it's like you get songbirds. And so this work, I always like to start with these important factors, because sometimes people put gardening, and especially ornamental gardening, in this box that's like, oh, it's just pretty, right? But this is work that really matters, and it really transforms people's lives, and it can solve real problems in the world, and I'll talk about that today as well. And I just love, quite frankly, that problems can be solved with trees and flowers. New York City is along the East Atlantic Flyway for migratory birds, as we are here as well. And so I'm sure you all saw that report a few years ago that found that bird populations in North America are down 30% in the last 50 years, which is 3 billion birds just gone from the skies. And a lot of that is due to habitat destruction. And climate change, and of course the drastically shrinking populations of insects that these birds rely on as their main food source. But the point here, when you look at a chart like this, is that wildlife are going to use our cities. They are going to come through, and it's up to us to determine whether or not our cities are hospitable to them or harmful to them. They've been using this land up in the north for 10,000 years, down here even longer, right, that these big migrations of birds have been coming through. And so when we make cities better for wildlife, when we make them better for regional ecology, it also makes them better for people as well. I really love how Robin Wall Kimmerer says all flourishing is mutual. And that was really one of our main jobs at Brooklyn Bridge Park, was to cultivate space for the pantheon of life on Earth, but also really keep in mind that it is for everyone's benefit. And one of the main tools that we used in order to do that were the plants themselves. The park is made up of mostly, but not exclusively, plants that evolved in that region and are called, of course, native plants. We would only use organic management strategies, and then we would research the life cycles of the animals and plants that we thought could thrive in the park, and then assess how our management practices interacted with them, and adjust when necessary to encourage certain populations. So plantings in the park were organized into what we called ecosystems, which sounds kind of hokey, but really it's the best term to describe a freshwater wetland like this, which we had 2 of, or our many salt marshes. But the majority of the park consists of this woodland edge plant mix that is made up of a huge percentage, it makes up a huge percentage of managed land in general. Often we end up living in this woodland edge mix. These spaces at Brooklyn Bridge Park were originally planted as sun-loving perennials, and then these tiny, tiny trees called whips that went in. And then over time, they grew and grew and grew, and then just eventually completely shaded out the entire understory of like most of the park. And we had to go in and replace it with shade plants, essentially, which was a real joy. And we got to use these marvelous combos of plants, like this is Virginia bluebells and celandine poppy. People think of spring ephemerals as being really delicate, but that is not the case at all. They're rough and tumble and ready for cities. But we would also put in little delicate plants like this ruin enemy or Jack in the Pulpit, and we would kind of hide them around corners. So that people who could have that experience of discovering them for themselves, the same experience that many of us who hike can, find these plants themselves. I did some designing there, but really I was caring for the land. And the way that we cared for land there, the way that we managed these systems, is a very different style of gardening than traditional formal horticulture. Normally, when a designer or gardeners will plant a tree, It is with the expectation that one could return in 50 years and see that tree just as they left it, just slightly larger, right? And in many gardens, the same is true for echinacea, that it's essentially meant to just stay there as a static thing. At Brooklyn Bridge Park, we allowed for plant movement and growth. Even death was an important part of those systems. We saw the beds more as systems that we were trying to kickstart, so that the natural cycles of the plants can take over and become more or less self-sustaining, or at least self-regenerating when necessary. And that was really working alongside the plants rather than dictating their every behavior. And so, for example, in this area, when a tree seeds in, when an acorn drops to the ground and begins to grow, it is such a precious thing. That to me is magic and wonderful. And also, that tiny seedling has a much better shot of living for a century than the tree that you go and buy in a nursery and put in the ground. That seedling is going to be able to adapt itself, from that initial moment, and is going to be better able to grow in those conditions than a tree that grew for 20 years someplace else and was planted in. And so we saw that next generation as the permanent canopy of the park that we were constantly trying to care for and usher into existence there. And sometimes we would end up with these really tangled thickets, which I think are gorgeous, but the public wasn't, taking selfies in front of them. But they're still really important. The thickets are incredibly important because birds, when they're looking for a place to nest, they will first look for structure. They will first look for a place to hide before they start looking for food availability. And so those thickets made the park really perfect. And so we were constantly thinking about how can we make these thickets more ornamental, right? How can we take ecological functionality and marry it with aesthetics that people will really need or really want to see in a park? And so that's where we came from, right? We were working with plants, but we were really trying to support the animals and fungi and all of the other organisms around us as well. And so that was the perspective, but what I'm hoping to do for the rest of this lecture is to really share specific techniques that we developed there, just a tiny sampling of our work, in the hopes that there's something here that might be applicable in your landscape as well. So for example, that wonderful bee we found, Bombus forbidus, we worked with ecologists in order to learn more about what else they needed. What flowers do they want to nectar on? What pollen do they need to raise their babies? Where do they overwinter? All of those questions we tried to answer and then look at our landscape from that perspective. And it turns out that many bumblebees will overwinter at the base of bunch grasses, like this little blue stem. And so here's our uncut back little blue stem. An entomologist told us that they like to overwinter right in there, under the grasses, right on that, the center of that bunch. And then this is our normal cutback that we do for little blue stem, that we make this little meatball. Do people do this around here? Same little meatball. And so what we did, thinking about the life cycle of this bee, was to leave those little skirts on, right? Try not to step in there as we were doing our cutback. Just cut off the top. You need to do this because these guys will rot. It becomes a fire hazard. You do need to clear out the top organic matter of these grasses, but where we could, leave as much as possible there. And so yeah, that was like a strategy. We never found Bombus forbidus nesting in those spaces. We found other bumblebees, but not Bombus forbidus. Eventually, we did find out where they nested in the park, and it was literally in a pile of trash. And so, you try and give them, this is an urban bee that is adapted to urban conditions, and that was what it was, and so we protected our pile of trash. And even though this one bee wants the trash, I do think that the levels of near immediate diversification that the park saw was due to the land care practices that we used. Because we kept on finding just these wildly charismatic animals that came into the park but were nowhere else in the city. This is a walking stick that is one of only 4 locations in all of New York City. Was happy and really spreading in Brooklyn Bridge Park. And we prioritized especially the charismatic animals because we weren't just trying to create habitat for them, we wanted to introduce them to people. We wanted people to be able to have these experiences of recognizing how amazing these animals were, and that the fact that they could share space in the city was wonderful. We also found the first sighting of the two-spotted lady beetle in New York City in more than 30 years, was at Brooklyn Bridge Park soon after we opened. And this was a result of not spraying the catalpa trees that they lived in. Catalpa trees get covered in aphids, and conventional practice is to spray them, even with an organic, hort oil or something. But that would kill the aphids and the ladybugs that eat them. And so what we were really trying to do with our work is to question traditional formal horticulture, which says you need to maintain a sterile environment. Because that's not reality, right? That's not, you can't walk outside and be in a sterile environment. Our work really looked at building up biodiversity to the point where pests will just stay in check and in balance. We're not trying to wipe out anything, we're trying to just keep things in balance. And that's because when you plant a plant, you've created a vacuum, right? There are herbivores that are gonna come and eat it. That's what they do, they eat plants. And then over time, there are animals that are gonna come in and they are going to eat those herbivores. But what happens so often is that when we notice the herbivores is really around the same time that those parasitoids and predators also notice the herbivores, and we wipe them out before their populations can stay in balance, before all of the forces that keep pest populations in balance. Oftentimes we come in and we just wipe out those pests as gardeners. And so, was that clear? I kind of garbled that, but I'll give you an example that will hopefully clear it up. These are oleander aphids. Do you have these orange aphids down here, right? They came in on imported oleander and they jumped out. And now they go after milkweed in the wild. And does anyone recognize these two unfortunate ladies here? I hear they're mummies. They're aphid mummies. And so what's happened to these two aphids is that a teeny tiny parasitic wasp has laid her eggs in those aphids. And they are right now a breeding ground for the next generation of those wasps. And in just a couple days, a wasp will burst forth from the aphid like an alien, and then mate, and then fly around and lay eggs in hundreds and hundreds of other aphids. And so if we wipe those out, we're getting rid of the mechanism that naturally manages those aphids as well. And so this is me standing in a patch of swamp milkweed with my iPhone, not moving, just taking photos. And you have from left to right, you have lacewing eggs, lacewing larvae, flower fly larvae, and ladybug larvae, all managing this population of aphids, all working to keep them in check. And so again, spraying would harm all of these animals as well. Sometimes with this whole approach, when you're working from an ecological perspective, it's really necessary to just accept certain levels of pests and disease that traditional ornamental horticulture wouldn't. Like this is cedar quince rust on our service berries, and it just is what it is. We would just lose some service berries every year. And we really saw the fungi and diseases, those are an important part of ecosystems as well. And they have roles to play where they thin out weak genetics and then recycle those nutrients so that other members of these systems can use them. So again, rather than trying to wipe out all diseases, we would just try to keep plants as healthy as possible. Doug Tallamy has this great 10-step strategy for dealing with pests and diseases, where you take 10 steps backwards, and if it's still a problem, then you can deal with it, but otherwise just ignore it. And I think that's really a cute way to think of it. And a lot of it's just really a shift in perspective, right? Like, and a desire to stop micromanaging everything. I look at these Taxodium midge-galls and I think those are actually kind of cool and sort of beautiful. And they tell a story of the landscape, right? They tell these stories that are wonderful. Sometimes we would go after certain species that we wanted in the park and figure out how to attract and support them, like fireflies. After the park was operational for about 7 years, I noticed that we had some fireflies, but not a lot of them. So I did a deep dive into firefly ecology in the region and figured out what they needed to overwinter, to mate, to eat, etc., and what sort of habitat they wanted to live in, and it turns out it's wet leaves. And so I asked the gardeners to find areas of wet leaves in their zones and just leave them, just let them go. Don't like water leaves, that would be ridiculous, but if you have wet leaves, go for it. And one of the gardeners, Pavel, who is an incredible naturalist, his zone within just a couple years had so many fireflies in the summer that people would come and put down picnic blankets at night just to watch the display at night, just because he was leaving leaves in the landscape. It's really incredible how quickly these things can happen. And Pavel also, he planted a bunch of spring beauty last fall. Do you have spring beauty here? Oh really? I feel like Claytonia is everywhere. I would be curious. I'll look that up afterwards. This is Claytonia virginiana, which is northeast, but I bet you have some Claytonia down here as well. I'll be curious. But it's this tiny little flower that only blooms for a couple weeks, and you can grow it in lawns. It's really wonderful. It's really sweet, and it's pink, and the pollen is pink as well. And there's a specialist bee that only can feed their babies this pink pollen. That's it. And Pavel bought, just last fall, he bought hundreds of these and planted them all around his zone. And literally that spring, the spring beauty bee showed up in Brooklyn Bridge Park, and this is the only population in all of Brooklyn that was just waiting, right? They were just waiting for these flowers, and the moment that he planted them, suddenly they're there and they can use them. So the Hort team, they do design and they do planting, but really as stewards of the land, what we focused on, and what was a bit honestly of a revelation for us, was the degree to which management dictates the quality of habitat in a landscape. That it's not so much which plants you plant, although that really matters. It's also the way that we conduct ourselves in a landscape that dictates the level of quality of that habitat, and whether or not nesting birds will be able to nest on the ground, for example. And so not long ago, we used to call taking care of a garden maintenance, right? But this work is just not an accurate description of the type of gardening we were doing there, especially in a dynamic system where nothing is static, everything's constantly moving. And so then we using the word management for a while, and that gave the landscape a bit of agency and made a bunch of gardeners feel really important because they were managing. But it was like a little bit corporate for my taste. And so now we use stewardship, right, as a really popular term. And I'll use all of these terms interchangeably. But the term that I come back to is always care. That we are taking care of these landscapes. And we're not just imposing our will, but considering what the land wants to be and what the ecological communities and what the human communities need out of these landscapes in order to thrive. And then, more than anything these days, I think of this style of gardening as just an incredibly pretty way to take care of land. And I love this framing because it sets us up as part of a landscape. It doesn't put us over the landscape, that we're actors and helpers and friends of birds. And I think that matters because a lot of people have a pretty bleak opinion of humanity these days. And I like to remind us that the problems that we're facing are not due to our species necessarily. And the sort of many issues of extractivist relationships with the planet that we're facing right now, those do not need to be what we carry into the future. That we can protect the ecological diversity that remains, we can cultivate it on our land, and we can literally build it when we have to as well. And a lot of that centers around the protection and planting of native plants in ecological systems. And so these are plants that evolved on the land where we're working, and alongside of, and sometimes at the behest of their pollinator partners and wildlife. Doug Tallamy and others have determined that for managed landscapes to function ecologically, they should have a minimum of 70% of native plants. I usually go for 80, but even that 20% leaves a lot of room for daffodils and lilacs and everything else I might want to put in a landscape or was there originally. Because the plants, the native plants, are absolutely central. They are the building blocks of these ecological systems, and they then lure back the animals and the fungi who have relationships with those plants. Other movements elsewhere in the world are completely different, like in the UK, have you heard of rewilding? that we have our own version of rewilding, but in the UK, that is a very specific movement where they use animals, and then those animals then bring back the plants, and they'll like reintroduce horses or wild boars into a landscape, and then that disturbance like supports the broader ecology. It's a fascinating system. They have lots of good data. It's not like actionable in a city park to release boars. Plants are just a lot easier, but you know, they're really central to the work as well. I think, you know, a lot of people, especially a couple of years ago, they would see a bee on a flower and they would think, this is fine, this is great, everything's working perfectly. They love those dandelions. And that might be the case, but it might also not be. Oftentimes when animals are using starvation foods because the species that they evolved alongside of aren't available, they'll do what they need to do to survive. They will visit, you know, whatever flowers they need to in order to feed their young. But it could be that the pollen, the chemicals in the pollen might make it so that they live shorter lives, less healthy lives. It could be that they're not able to reproduce at all. There's a lot of research being done now into these fields, and we're just figuring out how important native plants are to these broader systems. It's also important to remember that we're not just trying to feed bees, right? We're doing so much more than that. They found now that bees will use pollen to self-medicate. That sunflower pollen specifically can help clean out gut parasites in bees, and it's the shape, it's like the physical shape of the pollen that does it as well. There's so much complexity in the world that we're just learning about. Even with nectar, it's, I love pollination ecology, and nectar is a witch's brew. It's not just sugar water, it has yeasts and amino acids, and pollinators rely on it. In eastern North America, we just have the one up north, we have the ruby-throated hummingbird. You must have a few hummingbirds down here. You do, yeah. We just have the ruby-throated hummingbird. And they'll visit many flowers in our landscapes, right? They're on hosta, they'll go to many, many flowers. But it's only the red and yellow tubular flowers that you see that they evolved alongside of. And those are the flowers that contain the nectar that is curated just for them, and that has the right viscosity and the sugar content and the amino acids that sustain their extreme energy use. And it's the same thing with berries. There's now multiple studies that show that in the United States, our native songbirds prefer native berries. And there's also newer research that shows that the berries, again, that they evolved alongside of, have the nutrients that they require for their migration, for nesting, etc. And it makes sense, right? Like, the birds have been eating those berries for tens of thousands of years at a minimum. They've been selecting the berries with the lipid concentrations that they need in order to survive, and then preferentially distributing those seeds. So these relationships are ancient, and that's what we're trying to do. Rather than create new dynamics, keep intact these ecological communities that have been going on for thousands and thousands of years, and that are very, very threatened by the amount of disturbance that they're dealing with right now. But this work is also not just about those animals. We want the plants also to thrive. And many of those plants also rely on animals, that they rely on seed distributors and pollinators, and they can suffer when those partners go elsewhere. Purple loosestrife is a beautiful plant. I'm sure you all have it. Do you have it? Do you have purple loosestrife? You do? No, you don't. Okay, good. I'm glad you don't have it. It's great. It's everywhere up in the Northeast, although it's really diminishing now that there's an insect that is managing it. But it's everywhere in the Northeast in wetlands, and it pushes out other plants. But pollinators love it, and they love it more than our native wildflowers. And there was a study out of Massachusetts where they mowed a whole big region of purple loosestrife, and they found that all of the native plants in the region, the reproductive success went through the roof because they weren't visiting the purple loosestrife. And so again, it's about the systems, right? It's not about any one individual organism. It's about these dynamics and protecting and supporting these dynamics and the communities. And of course, people are one of the most important members of these communities. And so please don't think that I'm asking you to like rip out your peonies and whatnot. Many of the plants that support wildlife can be fit in and around all of the plants that are already in your gardens. I've heard many people say that we've changed the land so much that that with urbanization and climate change, that native plants no longer have a place in our environments, and that's simply not the case. There are plants for high and low pHs and wet and dry conditions. There's many plants that will live happily in construction rubble. We have so much diversity here, especially compared to other places on Earth. This is a garden that I designed for the Brooklyn Museum, and these plants are in 18 inches of soil, and they are in one of the busiest intersections of all of Brooklyn, and there are no gates and no fences to protect them from New Yorkers and their dogs, and it still reads as ornamental. So it's totally possible. And the goal with this garden was to lure people in with beauty and then sneakily introduce them to their regional ecology, which of course plants are a big part of. It is non-stop flowers from spring until frost. And I paid special attention to what happens when the flowers stop blooming, so that the small amounts of land that folks in the city that have access to would remind them of the autumn and show them what land is supposed to look like. And when I say that these are native plants, wow, am I being liberal with that term. There are absolutely local ecotype plants that evolved in New York City that are really hard to find, but we worked to get those into this. And the majority are plants that can be found, the species can be found in New York State. But there are absolutely plants from the Midwest with no known occurrences in New York, as well as cultivars with longer bloom times or shorter stature. And so in every garden, there's different choices that are made. And in this one, in front of one of the best museums in the entire country, it had to read as chic. And it was also literally on a sidewalk. And so I had to select plants that I knew would be able to survive foot traffic and sidewalk salt, and while reading as beautiful. It was the exact opposite of precious. It really had to be able to, deal with food vendors and children going to the school bus. It was that kind of a garden. And so far it's really working amazingly well. It's incredible. I used lots of butterfly host plants and placed them next to benches so people could have that experience. And in the first year we had dozens and dozens of pollinators found. And one person even found this guy. This is the hairy-banded mining bee, and it is the only population of this bee in all of Brooklyn that has been found, literally in a garden that's just on the sidewalk. It's pretty incredible. In the Northeast, gardeners and even homeowners have been leaving the leaves for a really long time now. Is that a movement that's popular down here as well? It's really important. It's really such a critical way for landscapes to function ecologically. And I think it's been so successful in part because it has this cute slogan of "Leave the leaves." They're literally called leaves. And I feel like we need more marketing people in horticulture as a direct result of that. But it's so important. It really is critical because the goal is really to figure out how land behaves naturally and then incorporate those processes into our ornamental and managed landscapes. And so leaves are a big part of that, right? And they're so much better than anything you can buy at a store or that comes in a bag, right? They're what your plants want to grow in. Your plants literally put their leaves there so that they can grow in them. There is a very funny idea out there still today that plants are just throwing their leaves away, especially in the autumn, when the reality is that they're carefully placing those leaves over their root systems, where they insulate the soil, slowly break down, and the nutrients in the leaves and the starches get reincorporated into the soil, support soil biology, and then can get reused by the tree in the future. It's like a slow motion carbon fountain, right? They come out of the tree, down into the ground, back into the soil, back up into the tree again. It's this beautiful, beautiful cycle. And I think a lot of gardeners imagine that we're creating the soils for our plants, and the reality is almost the opposite, that the plants are creating the soils that they want to live in, and we just get the benefit of that. And so we have the eastern juniper everywhere in the Northeast, and it's an early successional little shrub tree that can grow in a grassland really easily. And often on the side of highways and fields, you see these junipers out in the fields, and they're early successional plants. And if you dig a hole underneath that juniper, you find soil pH that is orders of magnitude more acidic than if you walk 20 feet away and dig a hole there. And that's because that tree is using all of the tools at its disposal. It's using root exudates and needle castings in order to change the environment to its most favored, environment. It's literally terraforming. It's terraforming the land. And that, as junipers do that, it then makes a hospitable environment for the rest of the forest to be able to come in, and that's how succession works. So that's what plants are constantly doing. All plants are constantly doing that. And so with our work, we're just trying to get out of their way, right? We're trying to let them go through their natural processes, but let them also create the environments that they want to live in. And it's better for us as well, because when you leave those leaves, and in an oak forest, when there's a good duff layer on the ground, that leaf layer can hold virtually all of the rain from a 2-inch downpour. Especially in areas where there's extreme weather, this is really, really critical. Also, the leaves slow water down as it's sheeting off a landscape, and that allows it to percolate into the soil rather than just going into the ocean or into sewer systems as well. As the leaves break down into the humus, carbon is also sequestered. It's one of the main ways that carbon gets into the soil. And a study this summer found that on average, landscapes where leaves hadn't been removed held 32% more carbon than landscapes where they had been removed. But of course, when thinking about wildlife and ecology, leaves are also incredibly important habitat. Of course it is. They've been falling on the ground for millions of years, and animals are going to come to rely on them. And so now there's so many different species of moths and butterflies and bumblebees that rely on that leaf layer. When you rake those leaves out of landscapes, you're literally raking away so many of the animals that we're trying to support. Again, studies this summer showed that when you do rake those leaves out, you decrease butterfly populations by nearly half. Half of butterflies, when you rake them out, are living in those leaves. And in the Northeast, it's important, the structure of those leaves is important because there's literally a whole ecosystem under the snow. And while you wouldn't have that here, the structure of your habitats is also as important as the plants that you're using to create the habitat as well. That this sort of complexity or messiness of the ground layer creates microclimates, even without snow, where different animals will live. This is a hillside at Brooklyn Bridge Park that we were reclaiming from weeds, and this is the left side is all native sod of native grasses, and the right side is a bunch of wild weeds, and like mugwort. And if you were a beetle, which side would you want to live on? The weedy mess, right? It has a place to hide, it has temperature regulation, has moisture, etc. Whereas this sort of monoculture that's just a blank slate, that doesn't have the habitat complexity. So the point here is just that habitat is also structural, right? It's not just the plants, it's also like the physical spaces that they take up. And that messy duff layer is really, really teeming with life. And that's what we're doing, right? We're looking at the way that animals use these landscapes and then organizing our work around their life cycles wherever possible. And of course, considering and prioritizing all of the organisms in the garden that we're working towards. And of course, there are many non-charismatic animals as well, right? We all focus on birds and butterflies, but in those leaves, in that duff layer, there are ants, there are beetles, and they're not always well loved, but they are super important to these ecological systems, and they drive whole networks like this ovenbird at Brooklyn Bridge Park. They only go to land where they can root around and find beetles and other animals in the duff layer. And so you just don't get the birds unless you also have all those other creepy crawlies in the landscape. And as I mentioned, these birds are in terrifying decline. A study came out just months ago from Science that found that butterflies in the United States have declined 22% in the last 20 years. And for all arthropods, which is insects plus like spiders, entomologists estimate that we have seen a global decrease of 45% just in the last 35 years, which is nearly half of insects on planet Earth gone just since I was a little kid. And that's for all species, that's an average across all species. Researchers have found that for insects that we used to think of as common, that they are disappearing even faster, that they're disappearing, that we will lose an additional third of those common insects just over the next 20 years. It's absolutely terrifying, the statistics are terrifying. And those insects are who feed the birds, some of whom require over 1,000 caterpillars a day to feed their young. So it makes sense when you see these falling bird populations and these falling insect populations that those two things are related. Most birds in North America feed their young exclusively on insects. And so supporting these food webs, it's not just important to stop the plummeting numbers out there. My hope is that we can get those numbers back. You might protest and say, leaves are so messy, they look so messy. And of course it's true. But is that tidiness worth more than giant moths and songbirds? That's really the question. I personally love the way this looks. This is my backyard in Brooklyn, and Japan celebrates this, right? In the United States, we just rake it all away. I still love the way it looks like this. This is winter at Brooklyn Bridge Park, and for me, aesthetically, this is nicer than a sheet of mulch. And this is what land is supposed to look like in the winter in the Northeast. It provides people with a sense of place. In a more formal environment, you can clean up the front edge and just put a foot or two of mulch. This is what we call a cue to care that says this landscape is intentional, it is not just being neglected. And when you do get a clean edge in the front and it looks nice and managed, you can get away with a lot of benign neglect in the rest of a landscape. We call that the garden mullet. That's really, really a helpful strategy. But it's still a lot of work. We're not just leaving leaves and walking away and calling it a day with romantic notions of letting nature take its course. There are some plants that can get smothered with leaves and you can't leave leaves on them. You need to know which plants can and can't handle that. There are different types of leaves that break down at different rates. Some leaves have diseases in them. They need to be removed. And so it's really this process of really studying and knowing the land. It's just different work. It is less work overall than raking and mulching, but it's different, more interesting work from my perspective. So at Brooklyn Bridge Park, we would always try and leave as much of the plant material as possible, not even just leaves, but seed heads as well. And nobody that I know cuts back their gardens in fall anymore. Everybody does cut back in spring now. And that's because the seed heads are so important for migratory birds, but also because it's gorgeous. It's so pretty. You get a whole extra season of beauty out of your gardens by looking at these gorgeous seed heads. In spring, we do cutback in areas that need it. But migratory birds are still using those seeds in the spring. So what we would do was to chop off, we'd look at the plants, see which ones had viable seed heads, which is not all of them, chop those off, put them in trugs, chop down the rest of an area, and then dump the seeds back on the landscape. And so that gets our cutback done, but also maintains the ecological resource of those seeds, and it cultivates a soil bank a seed bank in the soil. So that in these environments, at least, it's very important to keep weeds out that way. It was really helpful. And when we do our cutback, this is Christina, and she's illustrating a practice called the chop and drop. And so rather than using mulch, rather than bringing in mulch from someplace else, we were trying to use the plants, the plant matter themselves as our mulch. And so what she does is she's taking her shears and she's chopping down the grass, in this case panicum, in 6-inch segments, just bang, 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 going all the way down. And those pieces of grass fall to the ground, you sort of shuffle them around, and then that's your mulch. And it looks way better than wood chips. Wood chips or I saw pine needles here, which is honestly really gorgeous. We don't have that in the Northeast, but to me it just looks nicer when the plants are growing in what they want to grow in. Any stems that have 1/8 of an inch or greater of pith or center of the plant can be used by stem nesting bees. And so any stems that have that center, we leave those 18 inches or taller. This is what Heather Home calls stem stubble. And I think it's really cute, and you just never cut those down. You might not like the way that looks. Again, I like it aesthetically. I think it's better than a clear cut. But these stems also support plants, so they don't flop over. And you cut this back, and 2 weeks later, the green has covered them completely. So it's literally 2 weeks of your life that you have to look at this, and then you can appreciate all these adorable little bees as well. Certain asters at Brooklyn Bridge Park we would be very careful around, because we knew that the pearl crescent butterfly used their basal rosettes as host plants to overwinter. And so we would just very carefully work around those plants and try not to step on the leaves as we were doing cutback. And as a direct result, one time I counted 40 pearl crescents flying through the park in a flock of butterflies. Again, it's just really, really wonderful. Increasingly, we're also interrogating why we do cutback at all. Maybe there are areas where we don't need it. And whether or not it's really, really functional or even aesthetically the best thing. And I told this story in my TED Talk. I told it really quickly. But what happened was that a few years ago, one of the gardeners, Bella Ciabattoni, she's now Deputy Director of Horticulture, she had read that hibiscus mosquitoes has a bunch of beneficial insects that live in the stems, and we cut them all down in the spring. And she requested, as the gardener of her zone, she requested that she be able to leave them up. And as director of horticulture, I'm constantly trying to walk this delicate line between ecological functionality and landscapes that read as cared for to the public and my boss, right? So I could never let things get too messy. I always had to make sure that things look good, and I told her I was really worried that it wasn't gonna look good. And she said, you know what, let me try it. I'll clean it up, I'll take down some bent stems, and if it looks bad, we'll chop it down. And I said, go for it. And this is what she ended up with, which I find to be gorgeous. I know it is not a look for every garden, absolutely, but it's a new aesthetic, right? It's an aesthetic of the land. It's not just green and pink. It's it incorporates silvers and browns and all of these beautiful things in the landscape. And even if there isn't a look for you, it really does matter to find, maybe it's not the front of the garden, but maybe elsewhere in your land you can do work like this, because just 2 weeks after this, she found a song sparrow nest at the base of all of those uncut stems, literally nestled in between all of those stems. And a couple weeks later, we had this guy hopping around outside of the garden, a baby bird as a direct result of her research and advocacy and work. And so again, you might not like the way that looks, but hello, baby birds. Similarly, Pavel would leave all the milkweed up in his zone, and he was at the front of the park, the entranceway of the park. And it looked so messy, and I was like, Pavel, you have got to cut this down. You just can't have the front of the entrance of the park looking like this. And he sends me this video the next day. And this is a red-winged blackbird female, and she's stripping the fibers from the milkweed in order to make her nests. And it turns out that milkweed fibers are renowned among birds, that they use them preferentially, like Baltimore Orioles will use them to weave those beautiful hanging nests, because they can get these long and strong fibers, and they also have chemical properties that keep away mites from their babies. And so you just have to question, where are your values? Where are your priorities? Is it worth it? Maybe not the front of the garden, but you want to have this resource available. And for me, I ended up letting him keep doing this in the front of the garden, because maybe it is messy, but there's now an opportunity for a little kid who is in the city to watch a bird make her nest. That's so much more important than a tidy aesthetic. It's really the most beautiful thing. So this is a new strategy that people are employing, and it's a trend and a technique designed by Heather Home again, who's a wonderful entomologist. And what she's been advocating for is replacing the rings of mulch around trees with low-growing native ground covers, and she calls them soft landings, because they provide space for, if you've read Doug Tallamy, you know that trees like oak trees can support up to 500 species of moths and butterflies that are eating those leaves. Almost every single one of those species at some point in its life drops to the ground into the leaf layer underneath the tree in order to pupate or overwinter or what have you. They're also utilizing that space underneath the tree. And when they drop down and they hit lawn or mulch or, heaven forfend, a sidewalk, their lives are very easily cut short. And so when you reclaim that space under the drip line of the tree and you put these plants there, that gives these microclimates. You can also, depending on the plants you use, you can leave leaves in those environments. It's a really effective way to support all of the ecology around trees. This is in Boston Kennedy Greenway in Rose Kennedy Greenway in Boston, and it's a very utilitarian interpretation of this strategy. This is a public lawn, it's getting hammered, but this is one that I designed at Brooklyn Bridge Park and has the exact same functionality, right? And that's really the goal, is to like look at the ecological functionality there and then try and make it pretty, try and make it useful for people. And this is another one. This is at Brooklyn Bridge Park. This was a landscape designed by gardener Jungo Fujimoto. And it's one of my favorites in the whole area. And again, super highly ornamental, same level of ecological functionality where we can get that biodiversity because there's plants on the ground instead of mulch. Pete O'Dolph once told me years ago, he says, Americans like to display their mulch. And it's really true, we do. And thank goodness that is changing. But I think that a lot of this is like new grounds for gardening, right? You can fill what used to be a vacuum with host plants. You can put in green mulch, is what a lot of people are calling it now, where you fill those spaces with ground covers. And a lot of the plants that are good host plants for butterflies, etc., they can fit easily in between the flowers in your garden that are already there. We came up at Brooklyn Bridge Park with this really short green matrix that went everywhere in the dry shade. It's very diverse and could live under all of those fallen leaves. And it's very dynamic, it could like move around. And so trying to figure these plant combinations out for your homes, your parks, your gardens is really the best tactic to do. And when you get them, they kind of result in a sort of gridlock of stability, right? Where weeds just can't find their way in. This is my old front yard in Brooklyn, and I love it so much, and I think it's very pretty. And I do nothing. I literally do nothing to it. There's an oak tree and I pull out a bunch of saplings every year and that's the end of it. I might cut down certain stems here and there, but there's no weeds because they're effectively being kept out by the other plants. So those are just a few of the practices that I found to be the most helpful, and they may or may not be relevant where you work. Because obviously every garden is different even when we're working in the same state and region. So to wrap up, what I want to share are just the methods that we use to come up with these practices, because you will no doubt have different practices. And it's pretty simple. We essentially just stalked our wildlife, right? We would identify who was using, which animals were using the park. We would identify them with iNaturalist. Does everyone use iNaturalist? It's the best. It's so awesome. Best app. It like identifies everything. It's one of those many apps that identifies things, but then you can track it too, and you can like look at which butterflies are in your region, so you can see about supporting those butterflies. And then we would, once we had the ID, we would see what they needed for food, water, shelter, reproduction, etc. And oftentimes it was as simple as like strategically leaving certain areas alone. So for this guy, this is the painted lady butterfly. And we had a bunch of their host plants, but we wanted all of the host plants. And so I ordered one called Pearly Everlasting. And I ordered it, it came in boxes, and we went behind the office and I opened the box. And as I opened the box, the butterflies literally materialized out of the air and just went straight for it and started laying their eggs in it. And we put them in the back of the truck and drove them around the greenway, and the butterflies chased the truck down the greenway. And this is me trying to plant them, and I literally had to brush the butterflies off the plants just to get them in the ground. And I told this story a couple of years ago during the TED Talk as like incredibly hopeful and inspirational, but what I didn't share was that the caterpillars all hatched, ate the plants down to the ground, killed the plants, and then all died. Because it was just too much, right? It was too much. They were so excited. And so we learned the hard way that you have to plant them in the fall so that the plants can get established and be ready to deal with the onslaught of the butterflies in the spring. And so this, and I think, I didn't share that part during the TED Talk, but one of the best parts of doing that lecture and sharing this story out has always been like the countless people who write to me after being inspired and going and planting this plant and having that same experience and being able to attract a butterfly. To me, that's like radical and life-changing, to be able to see yourself and your children as people who can help solve problems with flowers. It just is the most amazing thing to me, and I'm overjoyed to see it spreading around. And really just to see us as caretakers of our ecological communities. So anytime we made a discovery like this, we would add it to one of our massive databases in the park, and we took our databases very seriously. I wasn't the only nerd there. And they're all up online. You can go see them. You're gonna have different butterflies and different plants, but there's gonna be a lot of overlap. We have databases for lepidopterans, for bees, for birds. We have huge databases of native plants that work in urban conditions and all of the information we know about it, as well as a weed database that I really love as well. I also will disseminate this information in my newsletter, which comes out monthly. It's way too much information, and I now just started a podcast if you're a podcast person. And so just quickly, we wanted the ruby-throated hummingbirds in the park. And so we went after them specifically. And so we planted every red and yellow tubular flower we could find. And it took 7 years, but eventually they showed up on jewelweed, which is this plant that people take for granted, but it's actually gorgeous. And yeah, it's just incredible. And they're just traveling through Brooklyn Bridge Park right now, but we want them to stay, we want them to nest in the park, and so we also leave up the seed heads of Anemone virginiana, the tall thimbleweed, because we found that the hummingbirds will use the silk floss to line their little beautiful nests that are made of lichen and spider silk. This is what they like to line them with. And they haven't nested in the park yet, but we're just like leaving them up as an invitation. And a couple of years ago, Pavel found this blueberry bee in the park she feeds her babies exclusively blueberry pollen. They will use redbud, but they don't like to. And blueberries in cities are hard because they like acidic conditions that we don't have. And so we wanted to support them. And so again, we researched what they needed. What do they want to nest in? It's sandy soil. We dumped sand on the ground and support them that way. We found the other populations of blueberry bee on iNaturalist, and we're looking at where those are in the city. And then we also look at blueberry populations in the city. Can we link these two together? Can we work with other parks and gardens and even homeowners to plant more blueberries and dump more sand on the ground to try and link these populations together? And this effort is ongoing. But that's the type of work that we did in order to support these populations. And so, and again, we're supporting communities here. And the most critical community here was the gardeners themselves. And I just want to clarify, if I haven't done it already, that this is the work of a big group of people. And when I think of all of the work that we accomplished at Brooklyn Bridge Park, the one that I am most proud of is having led this wonderful team and creating a good place for them to work, where people feel respected and get to follow their own interests. And it sounds so obvious, of course, everybody should be able to do that. But in our culture, manual labor has been systematically and strategically devalued. And so it actually becomes pretty radical to say, these jobs are important, you're doing valuable work, and we're going to pay you well and treat you with respect. Because you can't order someone to chase around a butterfly. That you can educate and inspire and provide space for them to follow their own passions. You may wonder why we focus so much on butterflies, and it's because everybody loves them. I personally prefer moths, but butterflies are a gateway insect. And they so clearly and beautifully illustrate the possible functionality of our gardens. And the reality is that everybody wants them around, but you just don't get the butterflies without the caterpillars, and you don't get the caterpillars without the host plants. And you don't need to pick between butterflies or people, because Brooklyn Bridge Park sees more than 5 million people a year, and almost none of them have any idea that any of this work is happening. And the wildlife and the people all fit together seamlessly. I do still really struggle sometimes with this work and with doing it now with the state of the world as it is, and climate change and imperialism and all of the horrors that we see on our phones every day. But I've concluded that gardens and landscapes have a serious role to play in bringing about the world that we all want to see. This is a photo from June of 2023, when Brooke Klausing and I returned to the Brooklyn Museum after having planted it just a couple months before. And we should have been overjoyed at the blooming of penstemon, but on that day, you could not see the sun and the air smelled like fire. And it was the second day of the effects of the Canadian wildfires finding their way to New York City, and it was absolutely apocalyptic. Even though people were still using the garden. They took care of their kids and looked at flowers and drank coffee, and I counted 5 species of native bees literally in the smog. It was super surreal. And I thought that day that we should all quit our jobs and go do something that more directly upped our chances of planetary survival. And I literally started arguing with my friends about it. I got super upset. And I finally called my husband, Chris Roddick, who was the head of arboriculture at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden for 30 years. And he is, thank goodness, a very super grounded guy. And he reminded me that outside of the Cherry Blossom Festival, the single busiest week the Brooklyn Botanic Garden ever saw was the week after 9/11. Because gardens get more important when the world is on fire, not less. And there are sanctuaries the same as they've always been, and they can be sanctuaries for bumblebees too. So I will end on that note. Thank you all sincerely.
Thank you, Rebecca, for sharing such an inspirational presentation. You've given us so much to think about. We're going to continue the conversation for about 10-15 minutes. We're going to have local leaders of native plants, landscaping design, municipalities here to join us. So I'd like to invite the panelists up to stage. We have David Manger of Roots and Shoots. Charlene Johnson of Native Plants to the People. We have Mayor Brad Belt of Gila Island. And Aaron Stevens, a landscape architect and principal at Circulus Design.
Who's out of place here?
So I want to start off with just kind of tying it back locally. I wanted to see if anybody, any of the panelists want to tell a story about an inspirational project that you've been working on or have completed that's been using native plants, and anything that you learned from Rebecca that you might want to incorporate in your next project. Charlene, do you want to go first?
Sure, and I actually shared some photos that might be inspirational, and I love the fact that if you go a few slides further, penstemon is featured, and this is a hell strip garden. So this is downtown Charleston. Hell strips are an area that are between roads and sidewalks. So they are surrounded by pavement. There's cars driving by, there's pedestrians, there's dogs doing their business. It is a challenging space, and often it is occupied by nothing but turf grass weeds. And the unutilized opportunity is tremendous. So we, with the leadership of the Marsh Project, which is a wonderful nonprofit organization based in downtown Charleston, mobilized a fantastic volunteer team made up of families and children, people from the area, and also people who were so inspired by the idea they came from outside the area to help make this happen. We converted turf grass mixed with reed weeds into a diverse native plant community that has supported so much wildlife. So the timeline was not very long. We converted the garden in April, dug up the turf grass and weeds, planted in April, and within months we had a tremendous growth. Our growing season, so I grew up in the Northeast, our growing season is unfair. It's amazing how quickly, after planting like a tiny little plug, which is a very affordable size of plant to start with, You can have a plant that is ginormous and covered in flowers and covered in pollinators, providing habitat for nesting, providing habitat to grow insects to feed birds, and the amount of community response for people who are walking, jogging, pushing strollers, walking their dogs. I help maintain this garden, and so many people stop and say, we love what you're doing here. So thanks to the Marsh Project for making it possible, for mobilizing, for starting it off. And so many people have been inspired by that little patch of land that they now want to plant those same plants in their yard. And so it's one tiny little health strip is helping to transform into hopefully an eco corridor that will go all the way across the peninsula of Charleston and hopefully all the way along the coast of South Carolina. So love the idea of seeing it in a really developed urban area and bringing it here to Charleston. And it doesn't just have to be in big suburban yards. It doesn't just need to be in parks. You can find a little health strip in an urban area and convert it into something beautiful and life-supporting.
I'm Dave Menger from Roots and Shoots, and I guess our celebration, I'd like to kind of celebrate everybody in the room, because about 10 years ago I started a sustainable landscaping company, and I just never could find the plants that I needed, and so I'd look all over the place and make lots of substitutions. And I eventually started to incorporate my own plants in there, in my little backyard, and then pretty soon I couldn't fit any plants in the backyard. And then we moved over to a brick and mortar store, and now we have like 8,000 plants in the back of in our nursery and growing around. And that's all thanks to the demand from everybody in our city. So I think everybody is doing really well, and we're kind of really pushing that big momentum with native plants and all the beauty and celebration that we can, bonding with the natural world.
All right, I guess I wasn't sure what story to tell, but you inspired me to tell about kind of how I got started in my own business. As Sean mentioned, I'm a landscape architect. I founded Circulus, a landscape architecture firm kind of focused on a lot of the things that were presented to you this morning. And, like a good entrepreneur, I needed my first customers. And of course, I'm like, oh, mom and dad, let me do your yard. And so they live on Isle of Palms in an HOA neighborhood there. So they had a front lawn like most people, and I convinced them to let me redo it. And it wasn't 100% native. There were a lot of natives, but also they wanted some culinary plants. They wanted some places where they could go spend time in the garden. So it was really just designing this thoughtful, kind of more productive than a lawn garden for them. And that's been almost 10 years, and I love still, my mom every year tells me that people stop certain times a year to take pictures of the butterflies in their garden. And that was never happening when they had a lawn. And so it started with a really, really small place, but it's really shown the neighborhood how, thinking about these spaces differently can be really beautiful and inspiring.
Thank you, and just a little plug for us, Erin did, I think, almost 3 different designs that we've installed on Kiowa and Seabrook, and so she was really the first person I went to when we were looking at native plant landscaping, because she was really the only one who was focusing on it at the time. So, and everybody in this room, all the panelists are doing such great work locally, and we've worked with all of them. Mayor Belt, I wanted to see from your perspective, how do you think local government can play a role in encouraging sustainable landscaping practices through policies, incentives, and public projects? And I know that the town of Key Island has specifically looked into ordinances relating to this.
Well, thank you, Sean, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here. Let me note at the outset that I'm not a landscape architect, I'm not an agronomist, I'm not a horticulturist, I'm not a biologist. So as an ignorant policymaker with regard to these matters, it's incumbent on me to get better educated from experts. People like Rebecca McMackin It's our own town staff, Betraya St. John, who's on our planning staff, Jim Jordan, who is a town biologist and the director of our Wildlife and Natural Resources Department, the leadership of my fellow council member Madeline Kay, who chairs our Resiliency and Environmental Committees, and partnerships with the Kiowa Conservancy and other similar organizations. I'll touch upon the living landscapes and native plants for a moment, because there are some things that the town is trying to do very intentionally in that regard. Things that we can directly control is ensuring that we are promoting and following a native landscape culture and ethos on the property that we own. Which is the municipal center heading into just before Freshfields Village, and we're looking at new options around that. We've got a project we're starting to initiate to redo the landscaping at the roundabout entering Freshfields Village, again, under the leadership of Betraya, to focus on native plants, but we want to work with additional stakeholders. It's maintaining a native plant landscape along Kiowa Island Parkway and Beachwalker Drive. So those are the things that we can directly control. And then it's also through the regulatory process. More recently, we've adopted a tree and landscaping ordinance. And I think we're pretty progressive as a town in trying to promote the planting of native trees and shrubs. Our ordinance requires that 70% of trees and shrubs be native, 50% of ground covers. And again, this is an intentional effort on our part to try to promote our native environment and protect the resiliency of our native environment in a number of different respects. But it's also educational efforts. We have a Grow Native database, plant database on the town's website. That's chock full of information. We put out a wide range of educational programs, including podcasts hosted by some of the folks I've mentioned on, composting and a host of other things. But if I could widen the lens a little bit, Sean, and apologies if you'll indulge me for a minute, this is part of a broader effort, a very intentional effort to try to position the town of Kiowa Island, with the support of the entire community, to be a leader, not just in our region, but nationally, on a wide range of resiliency-related issues. And that goes to the ongoing efforts of Jim Jordan and the Wildlife Department team with regard to protecting our native fauna, our bobcat research, our bird banding research, turtle patrol, the marine mammal network, all of which are unique aspects of Kiowa Island that you just don't find anywhere else. We're looking at adopting new ordinances to give us greater regulatory tools to protect our beachfront, to protect our river, and to protect our marshfront. We're early in that process. We've got to do a better job of communicating with the community about what the implications are, what the benefits are, and how we can all participate in this process. We hope that we can continue to build partnerships with everybody in this room in order to make that a reality. What makes Kiowa unique is not just 10 miles of beautiful beach recognized by Dr. Beach as one of the 10 best beaches in the world. It's not just the beautiful homes here. It is truly the unique natural environment here in the Low Country and all our diverse flora and fauna that we are stewards of and that we've got to work together to protect.
This next question I'm going to start with Rebecca. So you've worked in these highly urban spaces on really large scale projects. I think most people in this room are not involved in those type of projects at all. So you mentioned it already, a lot of landscapes you see here are pine straw. They might have canopies from trees, mature trees, but it's mostly pine straw with not many ground covers. Or in the more suburban areas of Charleston, you see turf grass, clear cut, really no wildlife, no native plants. What can a homeowner do in those kind of settings to start? How do you first start with transforming your lawns?
I think I would absolutely defer to the many folks in the room and on the panel who have more knowledge than I do about where to go to find landscapes that are beautiful, that read as beautiful to you, that also support regional ecology. And having those models, having those photos or botanical gardens or conservancies, to be able to visit and say, all right, this is something I like enough to be able to bring it into my landscape is really, really wonderful. Also, I mean, if you do get iNaturalist, you can go on, you can put in your zip code, you can find where you are, and you can get a list of the butterflies that have been in your region on this island, very easily. It takes about 30 seconds to do that. And then it's just a simple process of researching those butterflies, figuring out which ones you can support, what their host plants are, what their nectaring plants are, and then planting out those plants in your landscape as well. So I think there's two different ways to come at a home landscape, right? Is what look do I want? How do I want this to appear? What is beautiful for me and my family? What is functional for me and my family? But then also, what am I trying to support? Am I a birder? Is my thing beetles? Maybe, I don't know. And then what are the natural systems that support those animals, and how can I encourage them on my land? It does take research, right? But it sounds like you have a wonderful network of people here who are all able to support you in those journeys. And I think honestly that's really the beauty, right? Is that it becomes, to me, because it's this ongoing practice, right? It's not like you're buying a thing to have. That's like an old model of horticulture. You're growing plants that support communities that in return support you, and tying yourself into those communities in this really gorgeous way. And so it's not just about like an extension of your living room. It's actually about this really beautiful integration with the natural world, which I think is just a much healthier way to live in general. Is that an answer? That was kind of a non-answer.
Yeah, no, that was good. We'll pass it to the other panelists too. And we are running a little short on time, so maybe just a couple of tips for people to start. How can you start transforming your yard?
So what I'll suggest is just starting with some gateway plants. And one of my favorites has already been mentioned earlier this morning, which is Pycnanthemum uticum clustered mountain mint. That is a plant that was included in the health strip. It blooms all summer long, and using iNaturalist, I've documented over 70 species of pollinators visiting it. So a lot of people are really into bird watching and butterfly watching, but I'm really into insect watching. That just broadens it so tremendously. And I used to be afraid of getting stung. I was a kid who spent a lot of time running around bare feet. I had over 20 stings by the time I was 10. It was something I kept track of. And so I was a little afraid of things that stung. But then I planted mountain mint, and I discovered the glorious diversity of solitary wasps. So these are ones that don't nest in colonies, and they're not aggressive, and you don't have to worry about coming across them and getting stung. You can stick your nose in and watch them drinking nectar out of a plant, or parasitizing a pest, or creating mud structures or vases underneath leaves. So the tremendous diversity that you can bring into your life, the joy that you can bring into your life by bringing one plant in, and that is a gateway plant. You become addicted and just totally hooked on expanding from there. Another gateway plant, I'll just mention a few, scarlet sage. So we're talking hummingbirds, everyone loves a hummingbird. Scarlet sage has an incredibly long bloom season, it sells seeds, it makes colonies. All sorts of pollinators come, but hummingbirds are really showy. And you can grow that in a pot on your patio. You don't even need a space in the ground. And then I also love certain plants that are just really easy and formal and evergreen, and they have nice basal rosettes of shiny leaves through the year. So Stokes aster, beautiful fuzzy purple flowers, bees wading around in there. And they're shiny green, attractive plants year round. Penstemon is another one, has those tall stalks of tubular flowers. All sorts of pollinators come when they're blooming, but when they're not blooming, they're a really tidy little plant. They're great for planting underneath an oak and having part of that soft landings community. Sedges, leavenworth sedge, and I'm going to pass it on. But there's just certain plants, and once you start, you can't stop. It's just addictive, infectious, in all the right ways.
I'm going to mirror the gateway plant kind of thing. I guess my first step would be to watch a lot of inspirational people And if you don't have nature in your yard already, jump on YouTube and like just find some really cool butterflies or bees hanging around yards. And once you kind of have that idea and that bond, or that urge to have a bond with nature, like I jump in with one plant or two plants and just put them in and see what happens. But I would also say like here, and especially like a lot of more science-minded conversations around plants, they can really quickly like put you in a deep rabbit hole of like, oh, is this right? Is that right? Is this perfect? Is that perfect? And I would say perfection is the enemy of progress. So just like put something in a yard and then like maybe you'll slowly get better.
Absolutely. I don't know how much more can I add, because I was thinking along the same lines, but I agree, like, don't be scared. Start small, don't feel overwhelmed. I feel like sometimes people get overwhelmed, they're like, okay, now I have to repopulate my entire yard or acre with, you know, this native habitat, and it's like, no, just start with a small corner, and then, you know, allow that to grow and adapt over time, and you can expand it. Don't take on too much, and then also, as David said, you know, don't be afraid to tinker. Like, it becomes an experiment, so don't feel like the thing you put in the ground the first day is gonna be perfect, and that's gonna be there forever. It becomes, you're like setting the stage, you know, as Rebecca mentioned, for this entire process and system to get established. So be a part of that, you know, embrace the change in the landscape, embrace trial and error, like play around with it, enjoy it. And I promise you'll start falling in love with the caterpillars and the beetles and the birds and the bugs that start showing up. So don't get intimidated, just start small.
And I would say like, if you're not a professional, then like don't do it all at once anyways, because you're gonna have something bad.
Okay, well, I want to thank the panelists, I want to thank Rebecca, and thank everybody for coming here today. Can we give everybody a round of applause?